This lesson will be a continuation of Chapter 8. We will look at sexual reproduction and the determination of gender. There are two ways to reproduce. Sexual reproduction requires two parents, and the offspring gets contributions from each parent. Asexual reproduction requires one parent, and that one parent creates a clone of themselves. There are costs and benefits for each type of reproduction. For sexual reproduction, one of the major benefits is genetic variation. Having these variations in your offspring can make them more competitive in a changing environment. There are three ways that we get variation within sexual reproduction. The first is when the alleles come from each parent. Each parent has a unique set of alleles in their DNA, and they will donate one of those alleles to their offspring. The second method for genetic variation is crossing over. During crossing over, we see that parts of each chromosome will break off and it be exchanged. This happens between homologous pairs of chromosomes, so it's the same gene being exchanged, just from non-sister chromatids. Remember, this occurs during prophase 1 of meiosis 1. The third way that we get genetic variations is the reassortment of homologous pairs during meiosis. Remember, during metaphase 1 of meiosis 1, the homologous pairs, or tetrads, will line up randomly across the middle of the cell. This random assortment gives us different combinations of genetic material in each gamete. Having variations in your offspring can be a great advantage if the environment is unstable or changing. If we think about it, in an environment that is constantly changing, with the introduction of new diseases and new challenges, if every offspring was identical, a clone of you perhaps, there's a large chance that one variable, such as one disease, could wipe out your entire lineage. If you have variations in the population and variations with your offspring, there's a good chance that at least one of those offspring will survive and be able to reproduce, passing your genes down to the next generation. There are, however, disadvantages to sexual reproduction as well. One of the big ones is the cost. Sexual reproduction can be expensive. You have to find a mate, you have to sway that mate. Sometimes there's even perils in the mating process. For example, some spiders, after they mate, the female will actually kill and eat the male. This provides her with nutrients to help her lay her eggs. Asexual reproduction also has its pros and cons. One of the benefits is that it only requires one parent. It is also generally less costly in general, and sometimes having a clone is not a bad thing. Those cloned organisms may be very good at what they do. If your genetics are well suited to your environment and makes you very competitive, it may be advantageous to have babies that are exactly like you and can be at the same level of competitiveness. However, there are also cons to asexual reproduction. The downside is that your offspring are all clones. This is on both sides because, again, sometimes having clones means that they are all susceptible to the same thing. If one disease goes through that you are susceptible to, it means that all of your offspring are also susceptible, and they will likely die if exposed to that disease. So this brings us to the question, which is better, sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction? The answer is relevant. It all depends on your environment and the conditions that you are raising your offspring in. For sexual reproduction to be successful, we must have egg cells and sperm cells combine in fertilization to make a zygote. So how do we distinguish between males and females in nature? Interesting enough, no matter which species we look at, the definition of male and female is always the same. Females produce the larger gamete. Males produce a smaller, more motile gamete. This means that females will always produce large egg cells. Males will always produce small sperm cells. So where does the difference in size come from when we look at these gametes? If we take into account meiosis in males, we see that there is an equal division of genetic material and cytoplasm in every round of meiosis. This means that every time we take one cell and go through meiosis, we wind up with 4 equally small sperm cells. In females, we see the process is slightly different. The ovum cell begins by going through meiosis. We still see that the genetic material is divided in half during meiosis 1. However, instead of equally dividing the cytoplasm, we see that most of the cytoplasm goes to one large ovum cell. The others take the spare DNA and a little bit of cytoplasm to produce polar bodies. Those polar bodies are waste products, and they degrade almost immediately within the system. At the end of meiosis, we see that females produce only one large ovum containing most of the cytoplasm from that original cell. The information coding for the production of egg cells versus sperm cells comes from our DNA. In humans, that differentiation is made in our X and Y chromosomes. We see that females of our species will have 2 large X chromosomes, and males will have 1 X and 1 Y chromosome. So, thinking about this system, with females having 2 X's and males having an X and a Y, which parent determines the sex of their baby? So, if we break this down, remember, chromosomes will be divided into different egg cells or gametes during meiosis. That means that 50% of a male's gametes will have an X chromosome and 50% will have a Y chromosome. For the females, because she has 2 X's, it means that 100% of her gametes will contain an X. When fertilization occurs, the female always donates an X chromosome, and the males can contribute either an X or a Y. Okay. This means that, guys, if you want a little boy when you start having kids, it's all on you. It has nothing to do with your partner. Males contribute the Y chromosome that make little boys. Here's another picture of how sex is determined in humans. A female has a cell, parent cell, with 2 X's. At the end of meiosis, she will have gametes with 1 X in each. Males have a parent cell with an X and a Y chromosome. At the end of meiosis, he will have 50% of his gametes with X chromosomes and 50% with Y chromosomes. During fertilization, there's a 50-50 chance as to which gamete type will fertilize an egg cell from a female. There are physical differences between the sex chromosomes. X chromosomes are much larger than Y chromosomes. We also see that there is more genetic material housed on the X chromosome, which means more genes found there. Y chromosomes do have some genes, many of which relate to secondary sex characteristics in humans. The XY chromosome system is not the only system out there. It is fairly common in mammals, such as humans and cats. However, birds have a very different way of determining sex. In birds, the males actually have 2 of the same chromosomes. These are Z chromosomes. The females have 2 different chromosomes, one Z and one W. This means that in birds, the females are actually the ones determining the gender of their offspring. They can either donate a W to make the baby a female, or a Z to make the baby a male. Sex of offspring is determined in a variety of ways in other species as well. Ants, bees, and wasps, for example, have a very strange system of sex determination. For these species, the female cells will all be diploid. The males will be a haploid organism. This means that males hatch from unfertilized eggs that only have 1 copy of each chromosome in them. Females come from fertilized eggs that have 2 copies of each chromosome. Another strange situation is in turtles, crocodiles, and other reptiles. Many of these animals have sex determined by the temperature in which the eggs are incubated. For turtles and crocodiles, the warmer eggs will actually become female, and the cooler eggs will actually become male. This has a lot of implications in a world where global warming is becoming a problem. The warmer the eggs, the more females they will have. If we don't have enough males, that species may have trouble continuing on and reproducing the next generation. In this lesson, we've covered defining sex. We've looked at the definitions of gender. We've looked at several ways in which gender can be determined. We also talked about the advantages and disadvantages of sexual and asexual reproduction. In summary, we've seen that there's no one right answer to the methods of reproduction. Both asexual and sexual reproduction have their value. We've also seen that sex can be determined in multiple ways. In some organisms, such as mammals and birds, chromosomes determine whether an organism is male or female. In some insects, we see that sex is determined by having haploid or diploid cells. In other organisms, such as many reptiles, we see that temperature determines sex of organisms. Make sure you refer back to Blackboard for all the assignments that accompany this chapter, including the Chapter 8 quiz found in Launchpad.